In this episode, we are so fortunate to welcome back Dr. Darcia Narvaez. She's one of my all-time favorite human beings, and I'm so happy to have her back on the show and in my life. We're so fortunate to be able to have her share her work with us once again. So I kind of want to set the groundwork for kind of the events leading up to where we are today. With the crescendoing events which have happened in 2019 and leading up to 2019, I really believed 2020 was going to be an interesting year. I really had a sense of that. I didn't quite know how, of course, but now we find ourselves, for the most part, sheltering in place. And strangely, the world is trying to find a balance between economy and life, which is a pretty bizarre state of affairs, I think. So people have been sort of forced to focus on the essentials. So what do you think this time represents for us? What opportunities should we be seizing right now to better understand ourselves and our human-animal nature?
Well, I think it's a big wake-up call that we've been approaching life in the wrong way, from
Yes.
deforestation, which is causing the pandemics because of invading other life forms' habitats, and then bringing their viruses into our habitat. Because that's all the pandemics are related to that. So that's a problem, and that's come about from orientation to the natural world that we're superior and we can control it, and we can, it'll fix itself no matter what damage we do. So there's a whole bunch of attitudes like that, really of disconnection. So the big problem, I think, is disconnection from the living world. It starts with, I always say it starts with babyhood, when we aren't cared for properly and we get disconnected. The continuum of feeling like we're part of life is broken because our parents leave us alone or let us cry. And so then we establish this us against them orientation, dualism. And then we carry that forward in all sorts of ways, in the way we relate to others and the way we relate to nature, because we never developed that sense of wholeness, oneness, that is normal for our species in our ancestral contexts.
Yeah, so many people are wanting so badly to get back to what was considered normal, which really isn't even normal at all, in the context of humanity's time span here on Earth. And it wasn't a good normal. So it's really bizarre that people are, hugely focused on returning to that money-based, monetary-driven life. And we talked a little bit about what's considered normal in our first discussion here on Wild Roots. What's kind of weird to me about this time is that it really has become apparent that families aren't even used to spending time together. And so people are having a hard time adjusting to this. And I do think it's understandable that you can get tired of being around the same people all the time. But families really do seem broken. It's kind of not expected of families to spend so much time together in the modern world. I wanted to know what you thought about this.
Yeah, I think in the United States, especially, where the detachment instead of attachment is encouraged from medicalized birth on, where you separate mom and baby, you've undermined their bonding. Well, that's the golden hour. Their bodies are ready to glom on, this magical melding after birth, and that medicalized birth ignores all that kind of stuff. We're not animals.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a crazy, and then it's set up that way to, parents are encouraged to, sleep train their children, have them sleep in a separate place, and give them formula. It's just as good as breast milk, haha.
Yeah, sleep training does sound kind of crazy. It's like you're crate training your dog.
Yeah, as if it's a machine that you're dealing with rather than a human being of becoming, because everything that baby experiences shapes their personality and their orientation to the world. And so disconnection and what Ian Seti, the psychotherapist, wrote about in the 1930s. He said there's in the U.S. a taboo on tenderness. And so that, have grit, be tough love, and yes, baby, you have to learn independence, all that weird, crazy stuff. It kept coming about in part from our being a nation of immigrants who didn't bring the wise elders with them to help them learn how to raise children. And so then they use all these experts, so-called experts, telling them what to do.
Yeah.
And then we end up with disconnection. And so families who you learn then to have insecure attachment of one kind or another, usually avoidant, I think. That's the most prevalent, which is you like keeping people at arm's length and, focusing on your thinking capacities, not your social emotional intelligence. That's not developed well because you don't have enough face-to-face, compassionate, responsive care. And so if you got a whole bunch of people with avoidant attachment in a 2-room apartment, oh my gosh, nobody's happy, right? Unless they learn to reattach and break down those resistances they have inside to being intimate.
Yeah. As far as the, our wanting to get back to this life that we considered normal, what I really think this crisis points to is the ultimate elephant in the room, our addiction to modern conveniences and to the production of useless stuff, and addiction to money-dependent ways of living at the expense of our life-sustaining ecosystems. There are alternatives for how we could live out our lives, and this could very well be a turning point for people to feel encouraged to approach life differently, but only being concerned with economic growth instead of social and true sustainability is like a total red flag to me. It's like this is not where we're supposed to be. You wrote an article recently about how global capitalism affects your psyche. So how is global, in the context of what's happening right now, how does global capitalism affect us?
Yeah, so I relied on Joel Covell, former psychiatrist and then the founder of the movement Eco-Socialism. I've become an eco-socialist after reading.
Nice.
It's so wonderful. His 2002 book. So he's passed away. He was a Green Party candidate for president too in the U.S. But in his 2002 book, "The Enemy of Nature: The End of Capitalism or the End of the World," it's like, yep, here we are.
Yeah.
He wrote about how the growth is just this orientation to growth is of course tied to environmental destruction. And so he then notes how it changes your psyche. And he gives the case study of Bhopal, where that's in Bhopal, India, where they had a union carbide gas leakage at their plant, of pesticide, and killed, leaving over 500,000 injured and about 8,000 dead, and how they talked or thought about it, how it came about. It was all this poor decision making, very much oriented to money making and always cutting corners, because that's efficient, all about efficiency. And but after all that, their stock went up on the stock exchange. They made more money. They're because we're willing to be hard-hearted, right, and oriented to money and not, to life, essentially. And so he says what happens to the people. Well, a society becomes very disconnected and becomes oriented to commodities, right? Even people are commodities, objects.
Yeah.
And then he tells us that the psyche, what happens is you start to not see the negative outcomes of your actions. You have an optimistic denialism that, everything will work out. Humans will come up with the right technology to solve whatever problem we create. And everything's abstracted. There's just a real big emotional disconnection, being out of touch with nature, wild nature. And they are oriented, then their goals are to make a killing, or famous, and we know from other research that people who have power tend to act more recklessly. So
Yeah. Mm. It's happening.
it's
It
happening.
was the end of 2018, and I already had this mindset like, my goodness, this shit is hitting the fan. People, wake up. And that was then. That was before this crisis, because there was a series of crises leading up to this. It wasn't a surprise. It's This was going to happen.
And they've
Certainly.
been warned for decades that a
Yeah.
pandemic is coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, well, is this now considered it hitting the fan? What does it take for us to turn around? And I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it. And I want to feel hopeful, but not just hopeful. I want to see real things happening. And yeah, it's pretty tough right now.
So part of the problem is when you misraise children to be hard-hearted, to not build their empathy, is they cannot be vulnerable. They can't let themselves be vulnerable and feel grief. They can't be sad. And you can see that in these protesters around the United States right now, protesting shelter in place, wearing masks, whatever it is. No, I want my freedom.
I got to get my hair done.
Yeah, right. The inability to be flexible and tuned in and part of the whole. Again, they feel isolated, singular, one person's psychology, and it's all about me, right? Very narcissistic, completely. And that's what you do to babies when you leave them in distress a lot. They're going to become narcissistic necessarily because they have to protect themselves to stay alive. They have to develop some kind of sense of, you know, us against them in order to, and then put themselves in the superior position.
Yeah. And then that just fuels this deep-seated fear-basedness that just dwells within people, I guess, for the rest of their lives. I guess, I don't know. But these protest displays do seem to be stemmed from this embedded fear.
Yeah, that anger, that rage is coming from fear. Fear of, and they can't face. So if you go into psychotherapy, the therapist's job is to help you realize that going through the pain of that primal wound, reliving it to some degree you had pre-verbally when you were young, to feel it and go through it, you're not going to die and disappear. That's the fear these people have, is that if they feel those feelings, they let themselves become vulnerable, they're going to be gone. They're vanished. They're extinct. It's the abyss, right? But that's not true. Going through it feels that way, but then on the other side, you're much more alive and you're more connected and aware, and
Yeah. Well, so you also wrote an article kind of talking about understanding and satisfying your basic needs. What should people realize about our basic human animal needs right now? As the social creatures as we are, that sense of touch is missing for some people. And in one of your recent articles, you talked about how, our essential psychological needs, touch is perhaps one of our most important ones. So talk about that a little bit.
Right. So let me just review basic needs. I think most people think of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, which includes biological needs like food, shelter, safety needs, esteem needs, to feel like you're accomplishing things or are appreciated, love needs, and self-actualization. Now, his hierarchy isn't a hierarchy, it turns out. So, and there are other needs that people have identified in psychology, including autonomy, so having choices, being free to choose, control of your life. So that's similar. Competence is similar to esteem needs. So you feel good at something. You can do something that's admired. And then understanding, making up, adopting a narrative for the meaning of your life. And then, so purpose, having a sense of purpose.
That seems so important right now because, I mean, it's important any time in life, but there's all these fabricated ideas of, this crisis, and that is stemming from not meeting these basic needs, right?
That's right. So when you have an empty self, a hole in your heart, you're brokenhearted from your abandonment in babyhood. You have to find a purpose somehow, and it's usually going to be oriented to feeling superior, to having some kind of control over, what's happening and explanation. So then the other basic needs that I wrote about include also trust, which is a very fundamental first year basic need that Erik Erikson pointed out, that in that first year of life, you are establishing whether you trust or distrust the world. And I think what we've done now is we've undermined trust in general. And so it's just broken in people. And that takes so much work to get back to feeling trusting and being trustworthy yourself. And then a couple other that I add to the list are play, because we grow from play. Children need to play all throughout childhood. Adults grow through play. I teach my students to play folk songs in order to help them become present, to learn to be present socially with the other, emotionally there, and it grows the right hemisphere very well. And then nature connection. So all these, I argue, pretty much all of them, a baby needs at once. The baby needs to feel physiologically safe, physiological needs met, sense of safety, the sense of choosing and being, autonomous, having a sense of belonging and love and trust and nature connection and play. I mean, all those things are part of how you grow a human being. So a lot of us didn't have one or more of them when we were growing up, and so we have these gaps in ourselves, right? And so when we're older, we can start to try to fill those gaps by finding ways to meet those needs too.
Yeah.
Now, it's harder in shelter-in-place situations. It's harder, but one of the best things to do is to play. So if you're at home with kids, figure out games that are fun, that you can make up, that everyone gets to be themselves and create, be creative together.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that that sense of humanity is sort of being taken from us right now. Like, we're being challenged in such a way by our own humanity being undermined. It's very karmic. It's interesting.
Are you saying that the karma thing is that because we've mistreated so many people and
each other, the planet,
natural world, it's coming back? It's coming back to like a boomerang. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in our last discussion that when you mess up the natural world, it causes an insanity within systems and within ourselves, because things are not balanced, things are not well. Our home is unwell, and it just makes a lot of sense. So it really just goes back to nature again. I really liked the way that you concluded your article on becoming more peaceful no matter the circumstances, by referring to another piece entitled Nature Heals, Restores, and Comforts. So can you tell us more about how this aspect, this natural aspect, is nurturing to us and to our sense of well-being and ultimately to each other? Because it really does go back to nature.
It all goes back to nature. And it reminds me that someone mentioned today in an email the importance of the law of the farm. That's something that Covey brought up. And that means that, if you're a farmer, you can't wait till fall to plant the seeds and water and expect the crop to grow. You have to follow the cycle of nature. And that's true for us too. If we're going to live decently and well, and we need to follow the rules or laws of nature. And we've fallen away from that for so many generations now. So what does nature do for us? Well, there's more and more research about this. How sunshine is good for you because it builds the vitamin D and it's part of your immune system. And then earthing, that concept where 20 minutes a day of having your feet on the ground barefoot.
Every day I walk barefoot.
Oh, I love barefoot. Or you have these earthing blankets now you can get, and that can do the equivalent if you can't be outside doing that. just green, looking at the green around you, green things, living things, helps your mental health. So there's all sorts of things we're learning now. Playing is, again, always my basic thing that we need to do in nature, to just be there, be present in nature. My students worked on it all semester, nature connection in different ways. Watch the clouds today, and say hello to the trees that you pass, whatever it is, so that you feel like you're part of it. And then you start to pick up on that energy too. It starts to become part of you.
Could you tell us about the First Nations traditions that emphasize all our relations with the natural living world?
Yeah, all our relations, having right relationships, being in right relation with everything in the web of life around you is really critical for First Nation communities. Native Americans I'm most familiar with their writing and their discussion of these things, that you are not a virtuous person, a good person, unless you are paying attention to all those relationships. And that means with respect. So if you want to take the life of a plant for food or for making a basket, you ask permission. It's part of the honorable harvest. Is you go in with humility, ask for permission. If the plant refuses to be pulled, that's a no, and you take that as a no, and you go on to another plant, and you ask that plant permission. Can I have you? And so I do that now when I cut flowers or from the garden. And you do that with hunting and such. And so there's always this sense of that we're all in this together. I must share. And so you're always giving back something. So if you do take a plant, you give some. Traditionally, tobacco, which is a sacred plant for Native Americans, for example. And you have, and you start each gathering with gratitude towards all your relations that brought you here and all the four directions from which all the energy comes that gives you life and support, and just a very organic way of living that's very cozy and comforting and keeps you humble, that you're the younger sibling of all these wiser creatures. Like mosses have been around for 400 million years. Humans have only been around for a couple million, right? So we need to, in that view, the indigenous worldview, be part of, respect our earth creatureliness.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, as always, thank you, Darcia. Tell us, is there anything new that you're working on? What other good works are you bringing into this world?
Well, I have the evolvednest.org website that I'm adding to all sorts of things there, and we'll be doing more podcasts and blogs and books about that, trying to get the word out on that nest. So the Evolved Nest is not just for babies or young children, it's for all of us. We all need to be nested. Yeah. And so when we are alone and feeling disconnected, that's a signal that we have to do something to change that. Now, if you're alone in an apartment by yourself, you can still learn to feel connected. If you do meditation, if you have even a house plant or a pet, can help you feel connected to a broader sense of life. So there are ways to do it. It's more challenging when you're by yourself. But then if you have a 2-room apartment with 10 people in it, maybe you feel like that's too much. But actually that might be fun. There's ways to do it. So the life is organic. We need to treat it organically rather than like a machine, and treat ourselves with tenderness.
Well, I, for one, tell everybody I know who's remotely interested about the Evolved Nest. If there's anything people want to know about this podcast, that's the one episode, the Primal Nest episode, is the one that I recommend they listen to. So thank you for what you do again, as always. Darcia, thank you so much for being on this earth. And thank you for spending some time with me. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.